All right, so I didn't realize that it's been literally, I think, 6 or 7 days since the last video I did. So I typically try to do one sooner than that. So problem has been this week, aside from being extremely busy, that I've had like 6 or 7 different topics um, that I've been working on, and deciding on one, determining that you have enough information to go ahead and make a video has always been my problem. So I finally got a hold of Thomas, and I'm thinking maybe tomorrow we will do Mysteries of Manitowoc episode 4, if I can confirm that with him. But today's video is going to be about the recent segment, because it's not the entire interview, but the recent part of Bryan Dassey's interview. It's about half of it, I would imagine, because the investigator says she's going to flip the tape over, and that's it. That's the only thing that they released. They didn't release the second half of the tape, so there's still a lot of questions that we haven't heard his answers to. So we'll go over some of what was said in that brief interview. Thanks to Kaboom Zoom for coming out with that information, and also some more interviews with Jody. So having listened to those, it inspired me to make a video that I've been wanting to make for a while, and that's kind of what it's going to be pertaining with, is the timeline from all of these various statements. Because see, essentially, originally I didn't realize the amount of activity in and out of Barb's house that are in these statements. Originally I thought that most everybody was gone from Barb's residence at during the time in question. Well, the more I read, the more I learn, the more I ask people questions, you start to notice that all the claims that the state makes and all of the claims that are in these statements from these various individuals make it more and more highly unlikely that Stephen Avery even had any time to commit this crime that the state of Wisconsin claims that he did. So in Bryan Dassey's interview, the first half, the part that's been released, and if you haven't heard it, you can go on YouTube and type in Bryan Dassey's interview, and it's on Kaboom Zoom's channel, and I think it's about 19 minutes long. If you haven't listened to it, I'd suggest listening to it. So the investigators are talking to him. They're asking him kind of like what his normal day is like, and he tells them that typically he gets up, he goes to work 5:30 in the morning, and he works till 5 in the evening. Okay, so he works at Woodland Face Veneer, same place that his mom works, actually, Barb. Most of the time, they actually even carpool together, but this particular day, they didn't, from what I understand in the interview. So he gets to work. He works till 5. At 5 o'clock, he punches out. And I was curious to know how far his workplace was from his house. So I got the address to Barb's trailer and the address to where he worked. And it's 12.1 miles from where he worked to his house. And if he drove the speed limit, it would take him approximately 17 minutes. So according to this, if this is correct, that would put him getting home around 5:20. Okay. They ask him if he sees anybody over there, if he sees Steve. He said that he doesn't. They ask what vehicles that he sees over there at Steve's house when he gets home. He says that he sees his truck, the Grand Prix. I believe he says that the Suzuki is still outside on the side of the garage closest to his mom's house. They're asking him if he sees the snowmobile. Is it still in the trailer or where's it at? And he says he doesn't recall seeing the snowmobile. And he actually tells investigators that he really don't understand why they're asking him these questions, that to him they seem like stupid questions. So he's being, you could tell right away initially by listening to this interview that he is a lot more combative in the questioning that the investigators are giving him, a lot more so than, unfortunately, Bryan Dassey was. You know, he's not, when they ask him certain questions about certain things, he's obviously like, you know, I don't, like, for instance, when they asked him, do you remember what you was wearing that day? And he just starts laughing. You know, it's like, we don't carry a journal around with us and write down exactly what pants we had on a week ago or 2 weeks ago and on this day. And I remember pulling up at Steve's, and, you know, all of these things are going on. So what he says, the investigators asked him, was who all was at the house when you got home? He says that he believes Brendan was home playing video games. So keep in mind, this is around 5:20. Now, the state would have you believe, in one of their many changing theories, that Bryan Dassey at that time was at Stephen Avery's. So to me, that's a key note. That's a key takeaway from this statement. He said, they asked if Bobby was home. He says he doesn't recall if Bobby was home or not. And they asked if Blaine was home. He said he thinks he was. He's not for sure. If he was probably outside working on his bike. So right away, I found this interesting in many different ways. Okay, so when you start thinking about the timeline of October 31st, 2005, and all of the different statements, let's start from the very beginning. Okay, Bobby Dassey, his statement is that he woke up supposedly or, you know, say around 2:30, and that from anywhere, his statements kind of change from time to time, but let's say from anywhere from 2:30 to 2:45 is when Teresa Halbach shows up and takes pictures of this van. He claims that, but he takes a very quick shower. Okay. I mean, it had to be like a super fast shower, because he claims he looks out the window, sees Teresa taking pictures of the van, and then he claims when he gets out of the shower, he sees her walking towards Stephen Avery's garage. So she wasn't there for 10 minutes taking pictures of the van. I guarantee she only took 2, maybe 3 pictures of the van. That doesn't take very long at all. So according to his statement, he had to take, one of the fastest showers in human history. So he says he leaves, even though Bryan Dassey, in one of his statements, says that Bobby told him that he's seen Teresa Halbach leave the property. But she's there, she's taking pictures. According to Bobby, and he leaves. She's still there. Her car is still there. Okay. Well, if you fast forward to let's say 3 p.m. At 3 p.m., little after 3, somewhere in that area, supposedly Dolores brings Stephen his mail. And Stephen claims that when his mama's down there, she brings the mail. He actually sits on the golf cart with her and talks to her for a minute. Okay. So, in that amount of time, the state would have you believe that from the time she took those pictures to just after 3, so say from 2:45 to just after 3, state would have you believe that he already had Teresa Halbach tied up and already moved the car out of the sight from when Mama Avery brings the mail down there. And obviously at that time, she doesn't see a Rab sitting there. She doesn't see anything out of the ordinary. She doesn't hear any screams. Steve's acting normal. He's not rushed. He sits on the golf cart having a conversation with his mom. Okay. Now, at 5 o'clock, that's when things start getting really busy around the Yondas and around Stephen Avery's house. So, Bryan claims that he gets home. Now, I wasn't even aware of this prior to his interview coming out. Bryan says that when he gets home, he normally stays about an hour and a half. He gets a shower, gets everything together, because he always goes straight over to his girlfriend's house. A lot of times he eats at his girlfriend's house. He eats supper over there. So, according to his statement, if he gets home at 5:20 and let's just say he stays an hour, that's going to put him around 6:20 before he leaves the house. Now, he doesn't recall. Now, keep in mind, we still have to get the rest of that interview, but in the first 20 minutes of the interview, there's no mention of any fire being seen by Bryan Dassey. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is I just recently found this out yesterday, that in Wisconsin in October, the sun actually goes down around 4:40, 4:45. That's when sunset is. Now, it might not be completely pitch black, but that's when, the sun goes down. In Louisiana, and that time of year, it's more like 5:30. So, not had ever traveled to Wisconsin in that time of the year, I was completely unaware of that. So, I found that very interesting to know that the sun goes down that early in Wisconsin. So when Bryan gets home, it's dark. It seems to me, and like I said, we'll wait for the rest of the video to come out, but just for speculation purposes only, if there was a 10-foot tall fire behind Stephen Avery's garage, it seems like that would be something you would notice when you pull into the driveway of his house. You would have a pretty good line of sight to the area that was burning. And if you had 10-foot flames, to me, that would stand out. Okay. That's a pretty big fire. And that would stand out as a memorable moment. Oh, yeah. I remember that day specifically because Steve had this humongous fire behind his garage. So thus far, there's no mention of the fire in that part of the interview. Okay. Why they didn't release the whole thing yet, all at one time, I don't know, but they only released that portion. probably because the questions asked in the second half of the interview probably doesn't, it probably says things in there that the state don't want people hearing, is my only guess. So, like I said, 5 o'clock, 5:20, things are starting to heat up. Okay. Now, Scott, which has serious amnesia problems. Now, I've read all three of his statements, and I've talked about them before. But in the first statement, he claims that when he gets off done hunting, so if it's starting to get dark in the woods, if the sun is setting at 4:42 p.m., well, in the woods, it's always dark. It's darker in the woods than it is in a field. So I don't know if he was hunting in the woods or in a field. I would assume he was hunting in a wooded area, bow hunting, because you have to be close distance if you're bow hunting. If indeed he was. I don't recall if it was rifle season. I don't think it is rifle season in October. I think it is only bow hunting at that time, or muzzle loader. So assuming that he was in a wooded area hunting, around 4:50, he would have had to come out of the woods because you wouldn't have been able to see crap. So he claims that little after 5, doesn't specify what time, that he arrives. He leaves straight from hunting and he goes to Barb's house. And he picks Barb up because Barb, he had a text message from Barb, and she wants to go see his mother, who he just seen that day. So they go Scott goes pick Barb up, and they go to the hospital to see his mom. He claims in his first statement that when he pulled up, Barb was outside talking to Steve and Brendan. Now, he doesn't specify if they were by Stephen Avery's house or if they were by Barb's house. But he claims that Barb was already outside and she was talking to Steve and Brendan. Well, I'm sorry. He said that she was talking to Steve and one of her sons. He didn't know exactly which son it was. In his next statement, he says that when he pulls up, Barb is inside the house and she comes out of the house, and that there's a fire behind the garage of Stevens that has 3-foot tall flames. Okay, so that would be a reasonable little fire, nothing out of the ordinary, and that he sees Stephen Avery and one of Barb's sons standing close to the fire. Now, in both of those interviews, now this isn't necessarily important, but I noticed a correlation between his interviews, what he's saying in the interviews, and who is he giving the interviews to. And in his first two statements, the statements that are least damaging to Stephen Avery, he's given those statements, the ones I just talked about, he's given those statements to the DCI, the Department of Criminal Investigation, or Division of Criminal Investigation, whatever it is. It's not local necessarily, Sheriff's Department, what have you. Now, what's interesting to me, is that when Calumet interviews him, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, this interview takes place a lot longer after the event, so therefore your memory is not going to be as good as those initial interviews by the DCI. And he told the DCI that Barb was out there with Stephen and one of her sons, that in another interview, the flames was only 3 feet tall. What's interesting to me is when he's talking to the local boys, all of a sudden, his story goes that when he pulls up the flames, and we all know it, what he says, they're 8 to 10 feet tall, about as tall as the garage. I'm not sure how many of you watching has ever made a fire. I mean, some of y'all might live in city limits or whatever where you can't make a fire. I'm not sure or aware of the situation that you're in. But I've had a lot of fires in my day. I've spent my whole life outside the city limits, put it that way. That's a pretty big fire, 10 feet. I mean, that's actually an abnormally huge fire. You got to have a lot of stuff burning, which goes back to the ash, which we're not going to get on. But I just found it very interesting that once he's being interviewed by Calumet, now his story changes from a 3 feet tall fire to a 10-foot tall fire. Now, keep in mind that Jody calls Stephen at 5:36. So at 5:20 to 6:20, let's just say an hour, because Bryan said he's typically home an hour to hour and a half. Let's just call it an hour. Let's say he gets home at 5:20. So right now, at this instant in time, Bryan Dassey is home. Thus far in the interview, we haven't heard anything. If he smelled anything, if he's seen a big fire. But right now, from 5:20 to 6:20, Bryan Dassey is home. At somewhere around this time, Barb gets home. There's no statement of how big the fire was, to my knowledge. If there was a horrid smell coming from the fire. At 5:20, at 5:36, Jody calls Stephen. The first time. She calls him twice that evening. At 5:36, she calls him, and in her original statements, and we all know now that, she flipped the script, so to speak, and now that, she has all of these contradictory statements saying how Steve is this and that, what have you. But she calls at 5:36, and they hold, I want to say, 10, 15-minute conversation. And originally, she claims that nothing sounded out of the ordinary when talking to Steve. Okay? Everything seemed normal. He didn't seem nervous or upset about anything. He didn't seem rushed or out of breath. Had a normal conversation. So, all of these things are happening. Now, let me backtrack for 1 second. I wrote my note out of order. Just before Bryan gets home, okay, Earl and his buddy said they rode by Steve's house just after dark to go rabbit hunting. So somewhere around 4:50 p.m., okay, Earl and his buddies riding by Steve's house. Now, in their statements, yesterday I read that Steve was standing, when they rode by, Steve was standing. Well, one thing I thought was interesting is Bryan said he didn't notice the trailer and the snowmobile hooked to the truck, to Steve's F-350. But Earl and his buddy says that the trailer and the snowmobile was hooked to the truck at around 4:50 p.m., just after the sun's starting to go down. And they say that something seemed off with Steve, that he's standing there like a statue, essentially staring at the snowmobile. And I believe that one of them even asked him, Earl asked him, what are you doing, with the snowmobile? And Steve says that he was going to bring it up north, etc. So just to follow up real quick, 2:45, Teresa Hallbox on the property, according to Bobby. taking pictures. According to Bobby, she's still there when he leaves to go hunting. Okay. Around 3, just after 3 p.m., Mama Avery brings down the mail. Steve sits on the golf cart, has a conversation with her. 4:41. So about an hour and 20, hour and 30 minutes later, sun's going down. Here comes Earl and his buddy. They're going to look for rabbits. And they don't see a Rav. The garage doors close. But they do see Stephen. Okay. They claim that they see him going and coming. Because I remember reading that specifically. They claim they see him when they went to go out to look for rabbits, and they claim they see him on the way back, because on the way back, Earl's buddy, Fabian, or however you pronounce his name, told him he should have bought I want to say it was some kind of brand. I want to say Steve had a Polaris, and he told him he should have bought it was a different model or something like that. That's his statement. Then you get going forward, you get to the 5 o'clock hour. Here comes Bryan. Bryan comes home, doesn't see anything out of the ordinary. He's there till 6:20. Jody calls at 5:36, holds a 10 to 15 minute conversation. So that would put our timeline around 5:46 to 5:50 that she's talking to him. That's 15 minutes that he's not killing anybody. He doesn't sound distressed or, anything out of the ordinary. And then we jump to Scott's statement that he brings Barb home, but after they get done seeing his mom, he brings Barb back to her house around, don't quote me on this, but I want to say 7:15, 7:30 is around the time he brings her home. Now, in one of his statements that I read, this time he actually goes inside the house. Okay. Before he leaves, he goes inside the house. No smell. There's still no smell of a burning body. Okay. There's no curiosity going around as to why supposedly this 10-foot fire is going on over there with this horrid smell coming out of it. I mean, the gall that it would take for somebody to be burning a body right there in an open pit when anybody could literally walk over there at any moment. Okay. All of this is to show you how ridiculous this whole theory is of all these things taking place that the state said took place. So Scott brings Barb back home from the hospital. He goes inside. Eventually he leaves. Now, if you fast forward to 8:57, so let's say another hour and 20 minutes, Jody calls again. And she talks to Stephen for another 10 to 15 minutes. That's another 10 or 15 minutes that nobody's getting killed. He sounds perfectly normal. I want to say I've heard most of that entire phone call. I've heard so many I can't keep track of them, honestly, but nothing sounds out of the ordinary. Okay? He's talking just like he would at any other point. Okay? So at 8:57, another 15 minutes, that'll put you at around, let's say 9:15. He's talking to Jody from, say, 8:57 to 9:15, holding another conversation. Still, nothing seems wrong. Okay? At 9:06, Barb walks out of her house again, and she gets in her vehicle, and she goes to Scott's at 9:06 p.m. Barb leaves and goes to Scott's residence. No smell. No 10-foot tall fire. Not long after that, Brendan is back at home. He had to be home by 10. Okay. So now there is a question to whether this is even true, because the fact that Scott brings Barr back at 7:30, because in a phone call, Steve is telling Jody in that 8:57 phone call, Steve is telling Jody that he was trying to get Barb to wash her dishes, and she wanted Brendan to wash them. So there's a question to if all of this is even true. Like, all of these statements really are contradictory. And another point that was brought up today was somebody that I was speaking to, said that it's funny how all of these different statements are saying, well, I was here at this time and I was here at that time, and some of these times even overlap, but almost all of these statements, nobody sees each other. And that is very odd, you know. You have all of these overlapping timelines, and in almost all of these statements, nobody says, well, yeah, I seen Earl, or I seen Bobby over here, I seen Bryan, and I seen Blaine doing this. Like, there's a lot of gray area in these statements. And keep in mind, these statements aren't particularly helpful to Stephen Avery. I mean, the statement that Earl gives, saying that Steve didn't quite look like himself, and then they say when they seen him again, he had a fresh shower or something. And, you know, these statements aren't necessarily to help Stephen Avery or to hurt him. You know, these are just statements to the best of their recollection of what happened. But if you look at every bit of these times and you start going through the timeline, and trust me, I'm sure there's things I've missed because I haven't been able to put in the time necessary to really develop a timeline throughout all of these different statements. But I guarantee you somebody has, and I'll get the information eventually. But if you look from start to finish, from when Teresa Halbach showed up on the property till, let's just say, 10 o'clock that night, there's no room in this timeline for Stephen Avery to do the things that he was accused of doing. Okay. Supposedly, Brendan was home when Bryan got home, playing video games just like he said he was. So I believe Stephen Avery is innocent. Obviously, y'all know that by now. But even if you could try to convince me that he did do it, I would say 1,000% Brendan had absolutely nothing to do with it. If anything, let's just hypothetically speak and say, for instance, that Stephen Avery did kill Teresa Halbach. If anything, by the time Brendan got to Stephen's house, 7-ish, that's when he claims he got the call to come over there. All he was a witness to if he did see something on the fire. So, I mean, I believe Stephen Avery is innocent. Don't get me wrong, but it really pisses. Stephen Avery is 60-something years old. He spent most of his life, a lot of his life, in prison for something that he didn't do. But Brendan had his whole life ahead of him, and I really get heated up when I think about him sitting in prison, because of these investigators, because he didn't have anybody to stand up for him. He didn't have a lawyer there present with him. He was left in a room with two highly trained investigators, and the result that you got out of that is him doing life in prison for something that he didn't even do. So it's just interesting to note all of these different conflicting statements and timelines. And it blows my mind that nobody smelled anything. Okay. I was telling a guy today, I got some neighbors. They don't even live as close to me as the Barb resident, the Yonder residents from Stephen Avery's trailer. They live a little further, actually. And when they burn stuff in their yard, plastic and all kind of stuff, you could tell it's rubber or plastic or something because it stinks really bad. Even if the wind's not blowing in my direction towards my house, you can smell it very easily. Like you don't even have to question it. You smell it. It's very potent. So the fact that not one single one of these statements say, except for Brendan's coerced statement, and he mentioned one time after, they asked him a couple of times, he said, well, it smelled bad. Well, if it had tires on there, yeah, it was going to smell bad. But that's not even the smell we're talking about. We're talking about the burning of flesh, a very distinctive smell. None of these statements say that. Okay? Not Bryan, not Scott, nobody. So it's very confusing. It's very hard for me to get behind anything that the state says. And the fact that not one of these individuals said that there was a wretched smell, to me, further proves that nobody was burned on that burn pit at any point in time. It didn't happen. There's no way it happened. We've already talked about it. There is no ash around that burn pit to support a fire of the size it would take. And not to mention, let me bring this back up real quick and then I'll jump back. The forensic anthropologist and the burn specialist, or whoever heck you want to call it, that I spoke with, I did a video on this a while back. He said that you can burn a body and achieve that level of destruction in a pit like the one Stephen Avery had. He said, but it's going to take about 6 hours to do it, and you're going to have to keep it constantly fueled. Every part of the body would have to be engulfed in complete flame, and it's going to take about 6 hours to achieve that level of destruction. In a crematorium, it takes about 2.5 hours. Okay? So in an open pit, it's going to take about 3 times as long to do it, but you can definitely do it. There is no 6-hour time gap in this timeline for him to have pulled this off. Okay? There's no reports of any smells. There's no ash in or around that burn pit to support that theory. There's not enough bone in that pit to support that theory. None of it, to even furthermore convince ourselves of this, there is no evidence of these bones being taken out of this pit. They're not pulled out one by one. A picture's taken of each one, documented, labeled. There's no grid. There's no systematic, professional way that they conducted the extraction of these bones from this burn pit. I showed you the pictures in my last video where they go in with a skid steer, they scoop all of this dirt up, they bring it over to another section of grass, and they spread it out. And then they have, who I thought was a woman but turned out to be a man, police officer, going through the dirt, kind of looking through it, trying to find pieces of bone. And Bubba was standing over there propped up on the shovel, watching the cop do whatever he was doing. This whole thing is a disaster. And how are you able to get away with this is one thing that constantly comes to my mind, because it seems to me that if you contaminate a DNA sample, Sherry, that shouldn't, and I've talked about that in the previous video. It's not supposed to be admissible in court. But the judge granted a deviation to let her make a determination on it. To me, if the bones were extracted in the manner that they were, that's the red flag right there. It's like, well, wait a minute. What was the rush? Because you had the property for like 8 days. What was why wasn't a systematic approach and a proper protocol done to extract the bones, to where there would be no doubt or speculation as to if this was the actual burn site or not? Because there was only 10 to 12% of the bones actually found in the burn pit, which was never actually proven beyond a reasonable doubt that it was even Teresa Halbach's bones. When they got a small little piece of tissue off of a shin bone, and they only matched 7 out of the 16 loci that they needed to match to get a full profile. Only 7 of them matched. So your numbers statistically drop dramatically when you only get that many matches on the DNA. So that's essentially what I wanted to cover tonight. There's a lot of missing information that I have with this timeline. I've just been busy and I've been trying to piece it together. I just have serious issues with this. I mean, obviously this whole case, but the timeline in particular. There's no time. If you, for instance, anybody that's ever cleaned a deer, or even assuming that Stephen did it under the assumption that he did it, and he didn't dismember the body until after it was completely burned up. I mean, it takes time, 6 hours, let's even say 4 hours. You can't fit 4 hours in this timeline being able to completely burn up a body and nobody reporting any smell. You can't fit this crime into this timeline. And that's just my main problem with this. If you haven't heard the Bryan Dassey interview, make sure you go to YouTube and check it out. It's interesting. I can't wait until the rest of it comes out. But that's kind of what spurred this. I have a lot of other material that I'm not ready to pull the trigger on yet, because I just don't feel confident in it. I'm wanting to gather more stuff. This was kind of like a spur of the moment type deal, because I noticed I hadn't did a video in a week, and I've been working on this, and I've been curious about this ever since the Bryan Dassey interview came out, to kind of fit the pieces together of all these different times. So hopefully I'll get a hold of Thomas tonight or tomorrow, and tomorrow night we will do Mysteries of Manitowoc episode 4, and I'm sure to be as good as it always is. Thomas just been really busy here lately, so make sure you subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Feel free to share this video, like this video, and as always, if you have any other comments or concerns or anything to add to what I talked about today, any information that I left out, don't hesitate to let me know about it. And I appreciate all of y'all's support. And y'all have a rest of y'all's good evening.